Good morning. I'm still reporting on the economy. For the last week, rumors have swirled that President Trump is going around the Fed to keep the U.S. out of economic trouble as a result of the partial shutdown of the nation. Could it be that the monetary reform for which I have advocated for 25 years, since the creation of my documentary, The Money Masters, is finally going to start being put into place? It was really too good to be true, and so I've waited a few days to let the smoke clear before I made any comment on this. In short, I believe this is true, and here's why. Last Friday morning, Bloomberg's Jim Blanco published an interesting piece on the creative new financial entities the Trump administration has recently created to prevent the U.S. economy from grinding to a halt. Interestingly, even though Bloomberg is a respected financial news source, they still don't understand the most basic function of the Fed, which is the Fed does not print money. The Fed creates money, but they do so by increasing the national debt by selling bonds, notes, and T-bills to the public, corporations, and other national governments. Where does the Fed get these bonds to sell? The federal government, that is you, the U.S. taxpayer. And how much do we have to pay in interest on this national debt? A lot, around $450 billion a year. That's not repaying the principal, that's just the annual interest payments that are entirely unnecessary. Look at it this way. Why should a sovereign nation borrow when a sovereign nation can and should create its own money? If you ask the average person who creates the money in the United States, over 95% would answer, the U.S. government, of course. That's how our nation was founded. We just created the money. We didn't borrow it to create it. Printing money is the job of the United States Treasury, and our main problem for the last 100 years is the Treasury has done too little money creation, not too much. Yes, the Treasury still prints the cash money, but that's less than 3% of our national money supply these days. This debt-based electronic money created by the sale of interest-bearing bonds, notes, and T-bills is 97% of our money today, and that is all created by the Fed. However, the most important and destructive thing that the Fed does is to control the quantity of money. So who tells the Fed how much money to create? No one. Not the President, not the Treasury, not even the U.S. Congress. No one. The Fed holds the money power of the United States all to themselves. They create the booms and busts. They create and manage recessions and depressions. In the latest circumstance we find ourselves in, where a rampant virus causes virtually the entire nation to stop work, if it were up to the Fed, they would probably not move fast enough to save the economy, even if they wanted to. And some argue that they would allow it to crash or even help it to crash, as they did in the Great Depression of the 1930s. And this is no longer a conspiracy theory. The Fed has admitted their role in causing and prolonging the Great Depression in the 1930s by reducing the money supply. And of course, they promised never to do it again. Well, with a record like they have, President Trump was not going to wait around and beg the Fed to save the American economy. No, Trump stepped in and apparently has taken away the decision-making power from the Fed for the first time since its creation in 1913, 107 years ago. Instead of borrowing the money to give to Congress, to appropriate to save the mortgages of American families and the corporations that employ them, Trump has finally returned to the original ways the American colonies were able to create this new nation and tear itself away from England and her debt money system. We created our own money without debt. We just created it, then stood behind it. So the naysayers will whine that printing money will create inflation. Zimbabwe, here we come, inflating our money out of existence. But if we let the Fed create it, they would have to create just as much to save the economy, but they would do it out of selling bonds, that is, out of debt. It would be the same amount of money given to the Congress to spend, but with interest payments attached. Again, it all boils down to these two central questions. Why would a sovereign nation borrow when it can create their own money without the debt? Why? And number two, why would you give a banking corporation the sole monopoly to determine whether our nation lives or dies economically? You see, that's what the Fed is. It's a huge disguise, a fake-out. They pretend to be a government entity, but they are not. And federal courts have ruled that they are not. They are a private corporation, a corporate monopoly. And who are the stockholders in this corporate monopoly? The very corporations that benefit from having 97% of our money created as an interest-bearing debt, the banks. Plus, in order to become a chartered bank in the United States, you have to become a stockholder in this privately owned corporate monopoly, the Federal Reserve. This is the classic example of putting the fox in charge of the chicken house. But the way this fox has gotten away with it is that they have bought off the news media to convince we, the people, that none of this is true, that they, the Fed, are really a part of the government and therefore are only interested in operating in the public interest. But that's impossible. Why? Because corporations must act in the interest of their stockholders, and that is the banks. How do the banks make money? By lending. And who is the biggest borrower on the planet? The U.S. government. And that, my friends, is what our so-called national debt is. Every dollar in your checking account or savings account is created by the Fed as an interest-bearing debt, instead of just being issued interest-free by the government for the benefit of all citizens equally. Just like every dollar you spend on a credit card is an interest-bearing debt. Yes, there's no interest if you pay it off in full every month, but exactly how many people do that? No, it's human nature to spend now and pay off later, and that's how credit card companies make their money. So, understanding why we have a national debt and why no one in Congress seems capable of doing anything about it is what I have devoted most of my adult years to studying and trying to explain in simple terms to others. The bottom line was this was never going to be fixed by Congress. Why? Because the banks have the money. They are the ones who can lend liberally to a member of Congress who supports them to get that bigger home or that second home or not. That is the ultimate power, the power to lend. No Washington lobbyist can dish out as much money legally to so many people as banks can. But in the current structure, the banks are all subservient to the Fed. But Congress is also subservient to the banks, or those who do not comply could find themselves being primaried every 2 years, and those challengers would be liberally funded by those same banks. No, this problem could only be fixed by the executive, the President of the United States. Shortly after the 2016 election, a military officer, a member of Trump's National Security Transition Team, who had been a longtime supporter of the monetary reform goals described above, reached out to me and asked me to produce an urgent white paper of outlining the solution to the national debt situation because the Pentagon considered the burgeoning national debt to now be a national security problem. I wasn't sure at the time whether this was at the direction of the president-elect or not, but I immediately plunged in with my usual stuff. I delivered the white paper in less than 48 hours. I was told the president-elect had read it. However, I have no way of verifying that. 2 days later, Trump met with the editorial board of the Washington Post. He then went over to his hotel and gave his first press conference. There, he famously said, "I could pay off the entire national debt in 8 years of my presidency." What a shocker! No president in my lifetime has ever said something like this before. It indicated that my white paper possibly had hit the intended target. President Trump got a lot of pushback after that presser, and since he also had the entire media world up against him except Fox, pushing the Russia collusion propaganda hoax, the last thing he needed was to offend the entire banking community as well. So he had to bide his time. I think his plan was to let monetary reform slide until he had won re-election. But now I suspect that because of this virus outbreak, Trump saw his opportunity and has taken it. The left-wing media hoped to use this economic shutdown to wound the American economy sufficiently to damage Trump's re-election chances. But Trump has found a way to turn the attack around and utilize the resulting media hubbub as sufficient cover to begin to strip the Federal Reserve of its control over the quantity of money in the system. Remember, it's not what backs the money, it's who controls the quantity. To quote the Bible, "You meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today." 778-4156 and get your free investment guide today. Knowingly or not, when Trump tries to do the right thing, he aligns his purposes with God's intent. God formed this nation and miraculously allowed it to survive thus far, and he still has his hand all over its fate. Trump will never lose when he protects the United States of America. So exactly what has Trump done in the last few weeks? Here is how the Bloomberg report characterized Trump's actions. The economic debate of the day centers on whether the cure of an economic shutdown is worse than the disease of the virus. Similarly, we need to ask if the cure of the Federal Reserve getting so deeply into corporate bonds, asset-backed securities, commercial paper, and exchange-traded funds is worse than the disease seizing financial markets. It may be. Remember, Bloomberg is owned by Little Mikey, who just blew $1 billion on a vanity project to buy the Democratic nomination to run against Trump. Trump and his Secretary of State, Steve Mnuchin, have created a number of brand new alphabet agencies to take back the money creation power back into the Treasury Department. CPFF, Commercial Paper Funding Facility, designed to buy commercial paper from corporations. This is the way big corporations finance their short-term debt because it's cheaper than borrowing it from a bank. Then there is the PMCCF, Primary Market Corporate Credit Facility. This buys longer-term corporate bonds directly from large corporations. Then there is the TALF, Term Asset-Backed Securities Loan Facility, and the SMCCF, Secondary Market Corporate Credit Facilities, and the MSBLP, Main Street Business Lending Program. According to the Bloomberg article, to put it bluntly, the Fed isn't allowed to do any of this. The central bank is only allowed to purchase or lend against securities that have government guarantees. This includes Treasury securities, agency mortgage-backed securities, and the debt issued by Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. In other words, the federal government is nationalizing large swaths of the financial markets. But here's the key. The Fed is no longer the decision maker as to how much money is pumped into the system. No, the unelectable Federal Reserve Board of Governors is left to twiddle their thumbs as Trump and Mnuchin determine how best to save the nation. Bloomberg calls it a scheme. This scheme essentially merges the Fed and Treasury into one organization, so meet your new Fed chairman, Donald Trump. No, Mikey, the scheme was the Federal Reserve Act in 1913. Now that has been shattered and hopefully permanently, but Bloomberg again implies that this is only a temporary change. In effect, the Fed is giving the Treasury access to its printing press. The printing press, there you have it. They claim some non-existent constitutional right to own the money printing power of the United States. There you see the basic problem. The banks think only they have the right to decide what's best for America, but we don't elect our bankers. We only elect Congress and the President. That's the difference. Then Bloomberg fires a shot at the current Fed chairman for allowing this to happen. Fed Chair Jerome Powell needs to tread carefully, indeed, to ensure his cure isn't worse than the disease. Well, I'd be pretty mad if I had just blown $1 billion and made to look like a fool to the entire American electorate as well. We will know pretty soon whether this was just the most practical solution to a temporary problem or whether the President and Mr. Mnuchin are willing to really go for big-time change, long overdue change. Now here's how we will know. A couple of months before the next presidential election, the President could announce the economy is now humming along so well that he can start paying off the national debt. He can merely explain that he's going to pay back the bonds and other debt instruments with U.S. notes instead of Federal Reserve notes. The U.S. notes are the ones with the red seal. The Federal Reserve notes are the ones with the green seal. They are both still legal tender in the United States. However, the U.S. notes have been legal tender since the Revolutionary War, in essence, and officially since Lincoln created them during the Civil War. But in either case, they've been legal tender in the United States for much longer than the Federal Reserve note. So you pay off the national debt obligations as they come due, just in the normal procedure, but you pay them off with U.S. notes. For every U.S. note you pay back, you remove one Federal Reserve note from circulation and burn it with fire. That leaves the quantity of money in the United States flat, but extinguishes that portion of the national debt. This way, he could extinguish about 50% of the national debt in the remaining 4 years of his presidency. However, he could also accelerate the repayment schedule to complete the task before he left office, extinguishing all $24 trillion and freeing this nation from not only the annual $450 billion in interest payments, which is more than half what we spend on the Defense Department, but freeing this nation from the control over Congress and the President that being in debt brings. And that is the solution to our national debt problems. Then Trump's successor could ask Congress to pass a constitutional amendment removing from the federal government the ability to borrow forever. I'm still reporting from just outside the citadel of American freedom. Good day.